Please introduce yourself and tell us your connection to the Living Wage campaign.
Sure. My name is Dave Norris, and I am the former mayor and city councilor here in Charlottesville, and have been a longtime advocate for living wage. Have participated in many demonstrations and marches and protests and in support of the living wage. And when I was in office here in Charlottesville, got to actually work on it from the inside and worked very hard on living wage and living wage related issues as a city councilor and as a mayor. And so I just think it's a fundamental part of the social contract, or should be a fundamental part of the social contract in this country, is that if you work hard and do all the things we ask you to do, you should not go home living in poverty. So that's the basic concept of the living wage, and I've proudly supported it for many years and will continue to support it for many years to come. So.
What was your experience like during the protests of 2006, and what was it like being a city council candidate during this time?
So it was a pretty heady time. 2006, the living wage, the living wage movement at UVA has sort of been kind of a roller coaster over the years. And some years it's fairly quiet and a little dormant, and then other years it's super active. And it was, I was actually working at UVA during a previous era back in the late 90s. I was the assistant director, associate director over at Madison House here, and for 5 years. And at a time when I would say that was in many ways sort of the heyday, at least of early living wage advocacy at UVA, where everybody wore their little $8 buttons, and there was a lot of energy and activity around the living wage movement at the time. And it wasn't just at the university. I mean, the university was certainly a focal point, but there was a living wage effort at one of the local hotels here. It was just there was a big push, and so it was fun to be fun, and it's just rewarding to be part of that effort back in the late 90s. And then it kind of dipped a little bit, and it was just great to see it kind of come back in full force around 2005, 2006. Really dedicated group of young people. One of the things that I loved most about working at Madison House was challenging students to think about, I always call it like, we got to go from the hows to the whys, right? And so it's not just a question of how do we make sure we get food into the mouths of hungry people, how do we make sure we get homeless people off the streets and into housing or into shelter. Those are all really important, and that's sort of was Madison House, and their focus was getting students involved in volunteerism to address immediate needs, but we really need to start thinking about the whys, and so it's not just how do we help hungry people, but why are there so many hungry people in a city of such wealth as Charlottesville, Virginia? It's not just how do we help homeless people, but why are there so many homeless people, And when you start digging into the whys is when you start thinking about these broader issues like wages and housing conditions and lack of affordable housing and racial inequities in our community, across the board. And so I was thrilled to see so many students, in addition to faculty and staff, but so many students getting involved in asking those really hard questions about wage issues and economic inequities in our community. And so many people that were working very hard here at the university who were going home living in poverty. And so 2006 was a heady time, and there were some really super dedicated students who got involved with the living wage movement and decided to do a takeover of the president's office, and which sort of harkened back to some of the great social movements of the 1960s and beyond. And so I was a candidate for city council at the time. I was also running a homeless ministry at the time, so I was every single day encountering issues of economic hardship in our community. Many of the people that were staying in our shelter at night were working, some of them working full time and still not able to afford housing because of their low wages and the cost of housing. So this is a really long-winded answer to your question. But I was really pleased to play a very small role in the grand scheme of things, but to at least come down to UVA. There was an encampment out in front of Newcomb Hall. And so I came down several nights that week. This is a long campaign, but it really came to a head when the sit-in happened, and there were hundreds of people out every night on the front, out in front of Newcomb Hall, and kind of cheering on and supporting the students who were inside. I think there was 16 or 17 students inside. And I think I did give a talk at one point, but I was mostly here just to kind of be, show my face and show my support for what they were doing.
So kind of going off of that,
Yeah.
What did you focus on in your rally speech, and would you change anything now?
You know, to be brutally honest, I mean, I've given a number of living wage talks over the years at UVA and elsewhere, so I don't remember specifically what I said at that one, but I can guarantee you it was probably because I generally would speak on the very similar theme, which was, again, if you're working 40 hours a week, you should not be living in poverty. There was a related issue having to do with, you know, UVA said they couldn't require their contractors. In fact, to this day, they still say they cannot require their contractors, like Aramark, to pay a living wage. And I was there to say, you know what, the city of Charlottesville is bound by the same laws as UVA is when it comes to wage determination. And the state law is, there's a gray area there. The state law says that political subdivisions, which includes the city of Charlottesville, and includes the University of Virginia, it doesn't say that we can require contractors to pay a living wage, and it doesn't say we can't, right? So, the city of Charlottesville, several years before this, decided, you know, in the absence of any clear authority either way, we're just going to do the right thing. And the city of Charlottesville decided to pay all its own employees a certain wage, base wage, a livable base wage, but also require city contractors to do the same. And so in my talks at UVA, I've always focused on that point. Like, the city did it, we didn't have clear authority either way. And to this day, 2019, which is many years later, we've still never been sued over it. It's just part of the way we do business. And UVA needs to step up and make the same call. So focusing on just the immorality of working full-time and still living in poverty, focusing on the issue of contracted workers, focusing on the need for an institution as wealthy as UVA to do right by its lowest paid workers. I found it fascinating after all these decades of UVA dragging its heels on paying a living wage, in part because they said they can't afford to do it. Now all of a sudden they've decided to do it, and it turns out it's really not that big of a financial hit to the university to do the right thing by its lowest paid workers. And so it's frustrating that it took this long. I'm really happy that this moment has arrived, and I give a lot of credit to President Ryan for taking that step. Long time in coming.
So you've given your thoughts on Jim Ryan's new campaign to raise to $15 an hour. I think more can be done, or
absolutely. Yeah, well, I mean, we have to tailor it to the cost of living. That would be one. And to be honest, I haven't dug into the details of his proposal to see if it's going to be sort of, increased based on the cost of living each year. If there's an automatic increase, that would make it an even better proposal. But it's a great start. Obviously, $15 an hour is much better than what many employees have been making, but it's still, when you look at the cost of living in Charlottesville, particularly if you have kids, it's enormous. And a lot of that has to do with the cost of housing here, but it's not exclusively the cost of housing. So we want to see wages continue to increase to where we can get people to where they actually can live. I'm not even aiming for like comfortably, but to just be able to afford the basic cost of living here. Without having to make really difficult choices. And so when people aren't getting paid a living wage, they're either having to work multiple jobs to be able to afford to live here, which means less time with their kids, their families, it's a strain on themselves personally, or they're having to live in substandard or overcrowded housing, or they're having to live 30 or 40 or 50 miles away, or they're having to cut back on other essentials like medicine, like childcare, like transportation. So there's, we've got to keep working until the people who are on the lowest rung of the economic ladder are at least earning enough to where they can cover those basic essentials and not have to make some of these really difficult life choices. And it's not a political talking point, it's real life, and so I've seen it myself many times. I've experienced it myself at times. And so, you know, and I think it's just a measure of our society, how we treat people who are, you know, I mean, frankly, these are the people who are doing the hard work of making our university function, making our city function, making our society function, and the least we can do is make sure that they have a decent quality of living in exchange. So.
As someone who currently isn't involved with the university, what are your thoughts on the UVA demographic, faculty and students wise, and do you think it needs to change?
You know, I'm not an expert on it.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't quote you the current
Right.
numbers in terms of demographics. I know I read an article not too long ago that said there are, for instance, fewer African American students now than there had been in the past. I'm guessing the same is probably true of faculty, although again, I'm not, I'm just basing that on sort of anecdotal observations. But one thing that I have learned about recently is just sort of this effort to make UVA more affordable to families of lesser means, and I think that's hugely important. And I don't know exactly where that is, if that's actually in place now or if that was just a proposal, but you know, I think we have to do what we can to make higher education more accessible, more affordable to working class families, and so I think that's a great move forward. And but in terms of demographics, I just don't have a whole lot of like current information to opine on. So sorry.
No worries. How does a lack of living wage affect your perception of UVA culture? And also, how do the protests that have happened in the past affect your perception of UVA culture?
Well, as I said earlier, I've always found it heartening to see so many students at UVA and faculty and staff and others that have been willing to, you know, make a priority of advocating for others and advocating for the people that sweep the floors here and that cook the meals here and that do the hard work, that make the university function. And so, you know, we had students one year who went on a hunger strike. We had students who were sitting in the president's office. We've had students that leading marches and writing op-eds and, you know, signing petitions and all the great stuff. And that's what it takes to make social change, you know, is people caring enough to get mobilized. So it says a lot about the UVA, you know, the culture of UVA, that there are students here and faculty and others who have gotten involved over the years. And again, as I said, it's kind of had its ups and downs. But you know, I was, as I said earlier, when I was working at UVA, I was just consistently impressed by the level of interest on the part of students in making the world a better place. You know, and sometimes people volunteer through an organization like Madison House because they want to pad their resume or make their grad school applications look better. But for the most part, I found in interacting with students here, they were really interested in doing right by the community, getting involved in a positive way to help others. And so that says a lot about the culture of UVA, is that there are literally every year thousands and thousands of students who volunteer, who get involved. We want to encourage more of them to not just, again, sort of address the immediate issues, but to think about the bigger picture issues. And there are faculty here that do a really good job of that. I'd love to see the university play more of a role in making, and sort of devoting its intellectual resources to the betterment of our community, so not just sort of the volunteer resources and specific kind of programming things that go on, but you know, I can think of many examples, but one time when I was on city council, we were having a discussion, this has nothing to do with wages, but we were having a discussion about bicycle infrastructure in the city of Charlottesville. And we had a neighborhood meeting where we were talking about the fact that our bike lanes are very irregular, and it's not the most bicycle-friendly place in the world, and that we really need to improve our bicycle infrastructure. And this guy in the back row raises his hand. He says, you know, I'm an engineering professor at UVA. My students and I study transportation infrastructure in cities all over the country. We've never once been asked to look here in our own backyard about bicycle infrastructure, transportation infrastructure in the city of Charlottesville. And that was just sort of like this light bulb moment, you know, where there's so much good work that happens here in terms of studying issues and researching things, and we've got to figure out a better way to tap into that more so for the betterment of our community. So I think that would add even more to the culture of the universities.
Thank you so much. Do you have any concluding thoughts about the topic?
Well, my only concluding thought is that the 17 students who sat in the president's office that day, many of them I think may have questioned whether or not it was worth it, or that week. Many of them may have questioned whether or not it was worth it. Did they really accomplish anything? They got a lot of headlines, but did they really make an impact? And I think, you're not always going to see an immediate impact, right? But it's about creating and sustaining movement towards change, and these kinds of protests, these kinds of actions do have an impact. Sometimes it takes a little longer to really germinate, but what we saw from President Ryan's recent announcement is that the university has now come on board after years and years and years of stonewalling and making excuses and frankly kind of gaslighting on this issue. I think now they've owned it. Now they're saying, look, we want to do right by our workers, and so it did pay off. It made an impact, and a lot of people are going to benefit as a result.